Welcome to Leadership Forward, where you'll meet Arizonans with innovative answers to our state's greatest challenges. I'm Dawn Wallace from the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership at the Flinn Foundation. With just 48 days until the general election and 21 days until early ballots hit Arizona mailboxes, I think we can officially say the countdown is on for 2024 election. And that means it's a perfect time to have some experts come in and talk to us about what's happening on the ground here in Arizona. So I'm excited today to welcome two heavyweight champions in the political scene, Tony Cani, founder of Slingshot Campaigns and a 2014 Flinn-Brown Fellow, and Daniel Scarpinato, president of Wing Victory Agency. And these two folks know Arizona politics inside and out, and I think we are going to look to them to guide us through everything we need to know as we approach what I think promises to be a historic election cycle. So welcome to you both.
Good to see you. Good to see Tony.
Well, I have to
With
tell you.
48 days left, I have nothing better to do than spend time with them.
Well, I appreciate both of you taking time out. I will tell you, this is like the third time I've seen you together. At this point, I think you're an act, and you should take it on the road.
And I think you texted that to me.
I did, yes. After our last appearance together.
And I was like, we have the podcast with Dawn coming up in a couple weeks.
Well, so both of you have had really distinguished careers in Arizona politics. In some ways, you've had very similar roles. You've worked on candidate races, you've worked on campaigns, you've been political staffers. Can each of you, maybe start with you, Tony, tell me about, your professional journey, how you started and how, what's gotten you here today?
Yeah, I'm one of these sick people that have always been involved in politics since I was a teenager. It was just a thing that I cared about. I don't know why. I volunteered on my first campaign as a freshman in high school. And I always just knew that this was pretty much what I wanted to do. And I've had a weird career where I've worked in a bunch of different places. I ended up going to DC in 2006 after working a handful of campaign cycles here. And I worked for the Young Democrats of America. We got national money to, all of a sudden we had $2 million a year to spend on stuff. And then from there I went and worked on, I worked for SEIU where we were trying to get people to vote for Obamacare. I did that in Tennessee. I ran a big operation down there. And then I went and I worked at the Sierra Club where I was ended up being the national political director for a couple of years. And then I ended up just wanting to come home. I didn't want to do it anymore. And in fact, I quit politics, basically. I was just burned out and I came home to be with my family. And then I got the bug again. I started doing it again. And so when I did the fellowship, I was running a nonprofit that was all about just getting young people involved civically. It was called Inspire Arizona, and it was a family foundation had funded it that I, just got proposed. They approached me, asked if I would do it. And it was all about just getting young people to register to vote in a nonpartisan way, just to participate, to volunteer in their community. And so when I did the fellowship, I was like, boy, I really would like to go and work in government. And so I ended up going and working for the mayor of Tempe. They poached me. I worked for the mayor of Phoenix. And then after that, I did a handful of campaigns with, the last one I did on my own. The last campaign I did was the Biden campaign. And, 4 years ago, I was a deputy director and I've been consulting since. And so I joke with my wife that I have no other skills. This is it. I don't know what else I would do. I've got to keep doing this because, this is the only thing I've ever worked on in my career is in government and politics. That's it.
Well, P.S., your wife, Annie DeGraw, is actually a Flinn-Brown Fellow, too. So it's you're keeping the fellowship in the family.
Yeah,
and hopefully we'll get Alice.
Basically because of the fellowship. So thanks for that.
Well,
we weren't in it together, but our friend, yeah.
It's great. So, Scarp, you actually started in journalism. Mm-hmm. So tell me about how that's gotten you to where you are today.
Well, it has been a unexpected and unconventional path. I was always really interested in the media and in journalism and politics, but really saw myself more as an observer and referee. And then kind of over the course of time, I actually think that it's probably a lot more fun to work in the media now, and there's way more opportunities. But this was kind of in the 2000s when there were layoffs every week. The newsrooms were getting decimated, and I just looked at a lot of people. I was in my late 20s at the time. I was looking around, and all these folks who had worked in the industry for their entire career and were in their 50s were losing their jobs and not really knowing what to do. You know, what do? You've spent your whole life as a reporter in Tucson, and then, you know, you have to start over a new career. So I was kind of looking around watching this and thinking, you know, what is the career path for me in this? And then had an opportunity to go work on a campaign. I really wasn't, I was definitely right of center, and but I hadn't really thought a lot about my political views, and had never been in the advocacy space and didn't come up through that, and happened to go work for somebody who I believed in and thought was a good person, and then through the course of that, registered as a Republican and got involved, and then realized, wow, nobody from the media ever goes and works for Republicans. There's so many job opportunities. So even though we lost that campaign, there were a lot of opportunities for me, and I was really lucky to get some great. Actually, a story some people don't know is Dawn and I worked together in the House of Representatives, where I was communications director and she was a policy advisor. And she actually secretly went to the chief of staff and said, "Are you sure you can trust this guy? He was in the media and you're going to bring him to the inside." So
I'm not embarrassed. Was that meant to embarrass me?
Sounds like some good due diligence.
It's very good due diligence. Thank you, Tony.
Good staff work. So I've had the opportunity, went out to DC for a few years, worked for the National Republican Congressional Committee, and then and worked on a number of races, got to go all over the country, came back to work alongside you in the governor's office for Governor Ducey, and was really looking at it at the time as like, okay, this could be a fun 2-year gig to go back to my home state, come in at the beginning of an administration and have some impact, and go back to DC or go back to politics. And it ended up being pretty much a 8-year gig in some form or fashion, and was a great experience, but didn't really expect to spend almost a decade of my life back in government. So it's been fun now to be on this side and to wear jeans and not have to wear a suit every day, not have to have the weight of state government and all the issues that come with that on your shoulders.
Well, full disclosure, Scarp was my boss, but I probably didn't.
But you were really my boss.
Well, I was going to say
at the governor's office. He wasn't your boss when you went and ratted him out at the legislature, right?
No, he was my peer. No, but I must confess I probably wasn't a very good employee. But thanks for keeping me around. Well, let's pivot a little bit. I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to have you both here is your perspectives from your different perspectives on the 2024 election. This is a particularly interesting topic for our fellows. And I kind of want to get started with you telling me and the audience, what do you think the key issues are in this race that are impacting this election cycle? Maybe they're the same old, or maybe they're new, but I think I want to explore that a little bit before we get into some of the more fun, political predictions and all of that good stuff.
I think we probably agree on what the main issues are. And so why don't you start? And I'll tell you if you're wrong.
Well, look, if you went out and did a poll, I think consistently the top 3 issues are the border, the economy, and abortion are really the 3 that compete, definitely in Arizona. But I think that's pretty much across the country of what people see as the top ones. I think there's some other kind of animating things that may not really fit in those buckets, like reasonableness. I think people are kind of feel like there's the extremes in both parties have the loudest voice, and a lot of the voters who decide these elections have had enough of that. And then I think there's a huge desire just for change, which isn't really anything new. I mean, Barack Obama ran on change. That's really what every election's about. But I just think there's a level of dissatisfaction overall that runs kind of across the board that is animating this election probably more than others I've seen. I mean, I remember being in college like in the year 2000, and nobody cared about the election. I did, but you didn't see this level of like engagement from young people and kind of across the board. There was so much apathy. And when you look at even just like voter turnout trajectory, it's like people might say they're disgusted with politics, but they're much more engaged in the process, probably because they are so dissatisfied.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I would say an issue that people care about is the concept of democracy, which I think fits in with the reasonableness, which is just whether or not government can function and whether or not government is actually improving people's lives. The thing I would add, and I know that Dan and I have already talked about this before in other places, is the economy is everything, right? I mean, it just includes so many subcategories, but one that I think is especially urgent in Arizona is just the cost of housing. That's something that previously wasn't really showing up as a top thing, and it really is a driving force now. It is a thing that people are looking at the cost of housing either for themselves or for a younger family or for a family member who's older, and that is a major way that they are determining if the economy is good or not. It's a thing. It's a part of with inflation and everything, and so and it's an issue that I think people really are looking for some policy solutions to, and it's one of these places where there really is the possibility of some bipartisan support because it isn't a Democrat or a Republican issue. As many, immigration is an issue that is across the board, but Republicans are more animated by it. Abortion, same thing with Democrats. But when it comes to housing, that's something that people are just really, really worried about.
That's an issue that impacts people across the socioeconomic divide. So then this dissatisfaction, I think we have lots of data on that. People don't trust their government institutions. They don't trust their elected officials, and they don't trust the electoral process to some degree, right? Or the integrity of that. But has that then manifested itself in this very odd situation we're in Arizona, where we have a third? Is that what sort of drove that movement, or were we going that direction with folks coming into the state? I mean, what's the chicken or the egg here?
You want to take that first?
Yeah, I think that there's so many things happening at once that it's hard to say. Part of it is just like the process of voter registration. When you move here and you register to vote at the MVD, when you get your driver's license, you might not be compelled to pick a political party. And so that's just one of the things that's happening, that a lot of people who otherwise would be a Republican or a Democrat, if you look at the voter file, they're in the middle. That's one thing. And then, of course, dissatisfaction with the two parties has people leaving both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party and staying in the middle. And so, I think that's part of it. I think that people overall are looking at leaders and they don't necessarily see themselves in the people that are winning elected office. And I think that ends up making people not want to be a part of a political party.
So Scarp, I mean, to that end, we've talked about a lot as being a battleground state because we're perceived as being a swing state. Are we truly that? I mean, are we purple? Are we, what color are we? Like,
yeah, I think we are. I mean, it's interesting, and somebody could fact check this, so I might, but I'm pretty sure if you actually look over the last 20 years, to me, like, part of the interesting thing is it hasn't changed that much in terms of like a third. I mean, this has kind of been for 15 or 20 years that the voter registration numbers have looked like this. You've seen a trend towards independence. In some ways, it's almost surprising.
Statewide, especially.
Yeah. In some ways, it's almost surprising with all the growth we've had that it hasn't been more dramatic in terms of how it's changed. What has been different is how the elections have played out, that you're seeing more voters cross over, which has resulted in Democrats winning a number of statewide offices. I think a lot of that is that you've seen kind of a schism in the Republican Party. So there's a lot of Republicans who aren't satisfied with Republicans whose names are on the ballot. So they either don't vote or they cross over. That to me is kind of the more interesting story of what has made us a swing state, is that you've seen voters kind of drift towards voting for other candidates. And so you have seen this play out in divided government at the statewide level, the presidential race being very competitive, whereas Arizona was just kind of always a given that it would be a red state. And as a result, you've now seen just this barrage of dollars come in here, which isn't something people here are really used to. I think we're still getting adjusted to being in the center of the storm.
That's for sure. Yeah. That's for. I mean, I think that plays out both in the infrastructure on both the left and the right, or I should say Republican and Democrat, sort of to do this work to help win elections where we aren't really at a place where people are used to this yet. And then I think it also plays out in government where there's a lot of elected officials that aren't used to this level of scrutiny. They just really aren't. They're not, they're used to local reporters being the ones that are covering it. And as Daniel said at the beginning, with newsrooms being decimated, there's not as much attention being paid to, a legislator in a non-competitive district that might not be a committee chair. And now those people are going to get scrutiny for the things that they say and the things that they do. And it's been a big adjustment. And as a result, people are paying more attention. It's helped define the parties more. And with voter turnout being higher in Arizona, then I think that's one of the bigger changes too. Aside from the registration, is that more people are voting. A higher percentage of voters are participating.
Where are we seeing that voter turnout? Like, is it a particular demographic? Is it youth? Is it the Latino vote? Is it that?
I think it's across the board.
I think it's across the board. I think there's been a big bump in youth vote, but that's been national. So that's voting is a habit. If you can get somebody to vote 3 times in a row, they're going to be a voter for life. I mean, that's one of the things that ends up happening.
You can mail your ballot in, so you don't even have to leave your couch. To some degree, we've made it somewhat easier.
And what's really, I think, fascinating is just the realignment. And a lot of this is the impact of Donald Trump on all of American politics, but the fact that you have a situation where Republicans are more competitive with Hispanic voters, yet wealthy people in Scottsdale are voting more Democrat. You are kind of like seeing, like, it's not what you would have predicted in like 2012 after Mitt Romney lost and the RNC did the autopsy on how to win. You've seen kind of a realignment of the coalitions of the parties, and I think it's impacted how things have played out in Arizona. Part of why, for instance, like in some of these recent polls, the reason that Trump has a slight edge here, at least in some of the public polling over a place like Nevada, is he's way more competitive here with Hispanic voters than he is in Nevada. Yet you also have a lot of suburban, voters here who are not satisfied necessarily with the direction of the Republican Party and may have traditionally voted Republican, but are now voting Democrat. So I just think it's interesting, like these pockets of voters that are now up for grabs that maybe weren't a decade or two ago.
So how do you adapt to that? I mean, as political strategists, your recipe, your playbook has been sort of set for a long time. And now you're seeing these sort of anomalies or these changes, adaptations in voters and what they want. Do you then have to formulate a different message? Do you end up using talking points that the other side uses?
Well, for me, I in my career, I'm very annoying to work with. And one of the ways that I'm annoying is that I constantly am like, we can't just accept conventional wisdom as a fact. I mean, that's just the way that I've been for a long time. Whether that's like with some of the transportation stuff I do that's nonpartisan, I'm working on the Prop 479, which is the Maricopa County renewal of the half-cent sales tax for transportation infrastructure. As an example, that's a space where for years people have talked about those types of investments in one way. In government, we did it. We talk about job creation. We talk about revenue generation. And that's always been the assumption. That's what people care about. But, since 2019, when I did the Save Light Rail campaign here, where I had always talked about it, we found out like, oh no, actually like voters don't care about. That's not a thing that they care about. And when it comes to this, they care about how long it takes for them to get to work. That's it.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't in fact, part of the challenge is that, all of our institutions talk too much about that job creation and the revenue generation as opposed to sort of like the actual benefit that it has to people. And that's like an example that I highlight just because I think that is the same way with these candidate races where, for me in a larger campaign, I really want to do a lot of research. I want to do a lot of polling. I want to figure out where things are. On a smaller campaign, you need to have that feedback loop from voters that they're talking to. And I think one of the things that happened in 2020 on the Democratic side is that our state legislative candidates weren't knocking on doors because of COVID, because of the pandemic. And I think they didn't have that feedback that they were used to. And so they weren't really making adjustments to their strategy based on their volunteers and them talking to people at the doors. Mm-hmm. And so I think that overall, you always have to be making those switches. But when it comes to things like immigration, that's one thing where there has been some, talking point changes, but that's also just come from like what's been going on in government with, with the border bill and that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
So policy matters to some degree. I mean, we talk about politics as people make fun of politics as one-dimensional and superficial, whatever, but voters care about policy. You've mentioned transportation, you mentioned housing. So really, the voters find out a person's policy agenda through debates. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of debates. I mean, at the presidential level, back in the summer, a debate decided something. So pretty monumental.
You can't say debates don't matter anymore, huh?
True, yes.
Well, and that's what I'm talking about. Do debates matter? I mean, we just, we had a presidential debate there was some conversation about whether that was helpful to one candidate or the other. But at the state level, we're not seeing a lot of those debates, really healthy debates, public debates that we used to. Is that because candidates just don't want the trouble that comes along with being held to what they say in these debates? Or is it that people don't care and they're not watching?
Well,
or both.
Probably all of it. I mean, here's the deal: is I do think clearly the presidential debate mattered, or I think both of them did, but the first one to probably an outsized degree more than any other debate in history. I remember that when Kyrsten Sinema and Martha McSally debated in 2018 on Horizon, Channel 8, there was they put out that 750,000 people had watched that debate live, which, I love Ted Simons. That's probably the highest viewership he's ever had. And so I was shocked by that. I was like, wow, people really wanted to watch this. And so okay, that was a really close race. I think that debate probably did have an impact, and a lot of people decided had to vote based on it. I remember the late Frank Riggs, who people might remember, who ran for governor and then superintendent of public instruction. He had been a congressman in California in the 90s, and he told me a story. He was running against an entrenched incumbent, and everybody said he would lose, and he showed up for a debate at this community center, and hundreds of people showed up. And he then won this race. And he said that he thought that it was this, people were really dissatisfied. They actually showed up. So I think they can matter. I think oftentimes they haven't mattered in certain races. And, when you're on a campaign, it's a strategic decision. It's a time suck, especially if the candidate doesn't have a lot of experience doing it. There's a lot of prep that goes into it, what we would call bracketing it and getting your people to show up and all of the stuff that comes along with it. And I think in this presidential debate, I can only imagine, especially for the Harris campaign, that had to have absorbed so much of their time, given what we read about the prep that went in and all this stuff. That probably absorbed 2 to 3 weeks of their time. And, it was obviously a big event, but it's at the cost of all kinds of other things that you also need to do in a campaign.
Well, I mean, it would be worth it if it swayed public opinion. So does it?
Yeah, I mean, you only have a couple of moments in a campaign where everybody's paying attention, right? And in a presidential, I mean, the debate's one of them. And so in a presidential, even if it doesn't have a big impact, you are going to put in the time. We should put in the time to prepare. As you get, closer, farther local in these races, it becomes less important because less people are going to watch, unless there's like a big dramatic mistake or something wild that happens. I know when an exception to this is in 2019, the first debate for mayor that was televised. I ran the mayor's campaign, Gallegos. She did so well in that debate, and people were kind of counting her out. She wasn't really like the top candidate, and she did well enough in the debate. And I think there was something, I don't remember what it was, but it was after some other major televised event. So like viewers were higher than they should have been. It was like the Oscars or something, I don't know. And that made an impact in that race. But, in the recorder's race, which is a high profile race as far as the county race goes, Justin Heap chose not to participate in that debate.
Did that help him?
I mean, I think it probably helped him because he was going to be confronted with things he didn't want to talk about. But, and so it just depends on individual races. And if you have money and you're able to turn moments in the debate into something with your paid effort, with your, TV ad or mail or whatever, then it'll make a difference. But really, that's you taking a moment and putting it into another avenue.
So what's the silver bullet? Is it an endorsement? Is it a mailer? Is it commercials? I mean, I got to tell you, I don't watch normal TV anymore. I stream everything. And during the Olympics, I had to watch normal TV. And it's the first time in years I've seen a political ad. Like what's the most effective tool that a campaign has in terms of getting voters to look at their candidates to sway them towards?
I don't think there is a silver bullet anymore. I mean, it used to be a lot more simple, especially here in Arizona. If you were a Republican, you won your primary and then you were done. That's not the case anymore. And I think what Tony touched on of like in a lot of races, the door knocking, I mean, hard work pays off. The more vote, a lot of these legislative races last cycle, almost all the competitive ones were decided by less than 2,000 votes. You can meet 2,000 plus voters if you spent 2 weeks knocking doors. So I do think hard work pays off. I think in some of these bigger races, they do become about big TV ads and big messaging. But as we've seen, we've had some unpredictable races in the state of Arizona because maybe people have concentrated too much on what they think is going to happen and not, I think what Tony's talking about, which is actually listening to voters and kind of digging into what's really happening.
And by voters, we both mean, I'm going to speak for you, we both mean all voters, not just the ones that follow you on social media or the ones that come to LD meetings. And I think that's one of the big problems that especially on the Republican side that's happened, where there's a handful of candidates that just can't get out of this little MAGA bubble, and they think that some of the things that they're talking about are universal. And as soon as you get outside of that chunk of people, it's not that way. I mean, a good example is just the split when it comes to Senator McCain and how there is a chunk of voters that just don't like him. And it ends up becoming an issue maybe in some Republican primaries. I don't know if it would if people were to stand up for it, but then if they carry that over into the general election, it paints a picture for independent voters who are looking for a way to sort of make up their mind. And so like that's a huge thing. Door knocking, I guess it's not the door knock. It's like talking to voters is the most effective thing by far, as long as you're good at it, as long as the candidate is compelling. And there's some examples, Ami Shah, he won a surprise race for state legislature a couple of years ago because he knocked on a ton of doors and was compelling and talked to voters. And I think looks like a similar thing happened in his congressional primary.
And I think you see when certain segments of the electorate are ignored, that there are effects of that. We talked about the Hispanic voters. I mean, Democrats said, hey, we got them. Republicans said, we'll never get them. And now they're actually like, hey, we kind of want people to actually talk to us and we're going to make a decision. So they become much more competitive. One of the funnier memes I saw this cycle was after Kamala Harris was she hadn't gotten the nomination, but it was apparent, and it was kind of a mock logo that said Harris, boring white guy. Now the Democrats are like really competing for the white guys in the Midwest. And so I think that the idea is you got to talk to all voters, and you have to have a message that resonates across the board. Otherwise, you start to see issues or things that maybe you didn't expect in a campaign.
And in 2020 on the Biden campaign, if you look at the Hispanic Latino vote compared to other states, we did better in Arizona than other states. Part of the reason is because
Democrats did better
than in other states. Yeah, like the Biden in Arizona. And part of the reason was because our strategy, at least in Arizona in a big way, was like we're treating that demographic as a persuasion audience. We weren't treating them as a base audience.
Right.
And there's a lot of evidence that shows that you should be doing that. And, a lot of community work and all that kind of stuff. And that ended up working out that we needed to do that. And that's something that smart campaigns understand about, frankly, every demographic, but specifically Latino voters in this state right now who, depending on how far away they are from the immigrant experience, what part of the state they live in, how old they are, their gender, like there's a bunch of variations within that community, and treating them as a monolith is a gigantic, gigantic mistake.
And by the way, the inroads Trump is making aren't necessarily translating to other Republican candidates. It is kind of a unique thing
for that demographic.
Right.
You guys haven't mentioned white suburban women, and I know that was a factor in 2020 and continues to be. I mean, I think I read something, and I can't fact check me, I can't remember, but the election comes down to 100,000 votes, and embedded in those 100,000 votes are a bunch of white suburban women, and they seem to be kind of undecided from an ideological perspective, but then the character issue comes up, at least in the presidential race. I don't need you to tell me about the presidential race and who likes who and what doesn't, but are white suburban women a factor in this election? Well,
I mean, when you win by 10,000 votes like we did in 2020, everybody is a factor, right? Like everybody's a factor. Like you just saw Harris did an event in Mojave County, or, the Harris campaign did an event in Mojave County yesterday with Gwen Walls. And it's because, if you can get 2% more vote from a rural county that is extremely Republican, it's gonna help you in races that are this close. But suburban women are the driving force in the change in Arizona when it comes to a lot of what's been happening in their perspective changes.
Absolutely. I remember working on one congressional race where we lost by double digits, and I was so depressed, and the candidate said, "Don't feel bad. We didn't do anything wrong. The voters just hated us." On these races that are decided around the margins, every little thing matters, like Tony's saying, every decision, every turning point. And clearly this is, and it's actually all suburban voters.
That's important.
I have a chart that kind of shows, Republicans have lost a ton of ground among suburban voters. They're basically tied now. We used to win them by double digits. Obviously, among rural voters, we're doing a lot better. But when you look at Arizona, Maricopa County is basically one giant suburb. If we can't compete with those voters, we're not going to win.
And you've seen some of the polling that's come out with these county candidates, and some internal polling I've seen where people don't know these candidates. They don't know them, and Democrats are leading by one or close or tied, or depending on the particular race. And that is what Daniel's talking about. It's just that's just a pure demographic breakdown of the party, and that is a huge change that's happened in the state.
I'm going to ask you one last question about this. So let's say you get them to the ballot box. At least the voters in Maricopa County are going to be presented with a 2-paper ballot, like 2 pages of ballots.
Yeah, 4 pages.
4 pages, so front and back. Sorry. Yeah. And I think I read across all ballots, there are 265 contests, 144 elected offices, 45 judges up for retention, and 76 ballot measures. 13 were actual from a statewide level, 11 were referrals, and 2 were initiatives. Okay, so you got them to actually vote. How far down that ballot are they going to care? And if you are a political strategist like you, and you do have down ballot candidates, how do you keep them interested? Or you're working on a campaign like the transportation one,
which is the very final thing.
Is that on page 3? Or
it's on page 4. It's the very final thing on the ballot. It's the last thing on the ballot.
So like what are we, I mean, how are we dealing with voter fatigue?
It's going to be tough. And I will say, going back to our discussion about us not being used to being a swing state and in the national target, it's really hard, I think, to cut a message through on roads, on, this, that, or the other thing. I, by the way, think that thing's going to pass by a lot because I think people love roads and it's smart to be talking about it that way.
Tony's running a good campaign. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah, by the way, it's me and there's a big team working on that campaign. So yeah.
But yes, I think there's going to be a huge drop off. People, it's hard to cut this stuff through. And so to the extent that, I happen to think this effort to take out the justices, I think it's going to be really tough for that camp because I'm pretty engaged. There's been years where I don't even do anything on the judges. So I think to proactively get people to go through this whole ballot and fill things in is really tough.
There's some research on this, on how to prevent, political science will call it ballot roll-off, which is people not finishing their ballot. And, there's strategies that have been used in the past where you're telling people redo your whole ballot, vote from the bottom up. And the research is basically saying that stuff just doesn't work. And really, there's only one thing that works, and that's convincing people that an individual race is important. It's persuading people that race is important. That's it. And so it costs money, it's hard, and sometimes you're just not going to be able to break through.
I agree. And traditionally in Arizona, it's we've almost kind of thought of the day ballots mail of that's election day. And you got to get your messaging out and the election's going to be decided quickly. I think especially with the presidential race, I think a lot of the voters who are really going to decide these elections are going to keep their ballot for a while.
Yeah.
And I actually think kind of, running the tape all the way through the end is going to matter on all of these campaigns because I think a lot of these undecided voters on the presidential are going to probably drop their ballot in on election day, which means we won't know the result for 7 to 10 days after the election.
Yeah, and so from a tactical perspective, that ends up being a battle for search engine optimization because people are going to be Googling to try and find out how they're going to vote. And so you're going to get a voter guide maybe, you're going to find out about candidates, that people are going to sit down and they're going to do their research, especially the people who are voting from home especially. When I was at ACLU in 2018, one of the things that was happening was the votes were coming in slower for Democrats than expected. People were really nervous about it, if you remember. But what we were experiencing in that office was we were getting an unbelievable number of phone calls from people that we never would have gotten phone calls from who just were how am I supposed to vote on, some of the smaller things like the judges and some of these other things. And it's because people were focused enough and determined enough that they were doing the research to get all the way down ballot, at least a chunk of them. And that's the question, is that in a presidential election where you're getting all these people that are going to be showing up because they care about the presidential, will that even trickle down? And that has an impact on vote choice. I think a big thing that's happened in these past couple elections is that we as Democrats on the Biden campaign, Hobbs as well, Sinema, to a lesser extent, just because it was a longer time ago, we're convincing some Republicans to vote for us. And it's really, really hard to get a partisan to cross over for more than 2 races. And so the farther down the ballot, it's oh my gosh, I voted for Joe Biden and I voted for Mark Kelly. I can't vote for this Democrat state legislature.
We saw that in 2022,
even if they're
right?
totally lined up, even if the issues are the same. And that all comes down to just the way people think as they're voting. It's just a major part of this.
That's so astute. I completely agree. I also think,
God, you guys agree more than you disagree. How shocking.
On tactics.
Yeah, we just want different people to win.
We just want different people to win, yeah.
I think obviously Republicans shot ourselves in the foot on these early ballots the last couple cycles.
What a wild decision.
And this is exactly why I think the early ballots have so much value and why Arizonans love them so much is that you can actually sit down, take your time with your ballot, research things, etc. And so I'm for all of the above. Like, I'm not one of these people who wants to get rid of election day voting, but I definitely think the early ballots, it's why so many Arizonans, including Republicans, like voting with them. Because if you've got a 4-page ballot, it's not like you're stressed in a polling place in a school trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah, I agree. I lied. I said that was the last question, but I'm going to ask you this very, very direct. I mean, to what extent, you say people are coming out for the presidential. To what extent do you think that this election is really about abortion? Well, are we getting more people out because of abortion versus the presidential?
There was a story in the Republic this morning where they were saying there wasn't really a vote surge since the Roe decision. I don't know if I buy the way that they did their math on things, because they were looking at some like vote share as a way to do this, meaning like, are more women voting than men? I think that it is top of mind for a lot of voters, whether or not they're for abortion or against abortion. And it is a thing that most people don't think they need any additional information about. They have an opinion that's already made up. So it's an easy thing to decide for and against the candidate based on abortion. And that is that's one of the reasons why it's such a powerful issue, is that it might be the fourth thing on the list for a particular voter, but they don't have to figure out, I don't know where that person is on the economy. I don't understand whether or not that immigration plan is going to be right, but on abortion, I get it. So I do think that as a result, it's extremely important in this election. And you can just look at the races the past couple times. I don't think that it's the thing that every voter is thinking about, but anyone who tries to dismiss it, I think that they're not thinking about this the right way.
Do you think it's as important to the right as it is to the left?
Well, I think people were advised to dismiss it last time, Republicans, and most of them lost. And so Tony's right, it can't be dismissed. I also think that in Arizona, this ballot measure had more of the potential to be a turnout juggernaut before the change in the presidential nominee. I think Harris attracts a lot of the voters to vote that may have been motivated just to vote on that. And then I'll also say what is most fascinating about it, if in fact you believe the proponents that it's going to pass by 65%, and the presidential is at 48-48, that means a lot of people who are voting for Donald Trump are going to vote for this measure.
And sometimes people are like, there's no way somebody voted for Sinema and Ducey, which now we're like, okay, there's a lot of way. But there's no way somebody voted for Kari Lake and voted for like Mark Kelly. But yes, it happens. People are making up their mind to vote in ways that those of us who are super engaged don't always understand. There's gonna be people who do that. It's just, that is the nature of democracy.
And we love democracy at the Flinn Foundation. So thank you both so much for coming in. This is a busy time for you. Tony, I appreciate you as a Flinn-Brown Fellow continuing our sort of mission around engaging in civic life and certainly compelling people to also give their time in elected office. And Scarp, I spent half of my professional life with you. It's nice to see you across and be able to interview. And I will say that when I came on your podcast, you gave me a little too much to drink, and I probably wasn't. I was going to say I probably wasn't as articulate as you are today. But thank you so much for being on Leadership Forward for a Better Arizona. That wraps up this episode of Leadership Forward. You can find out more about the work of the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership at our website, azcivicleadership.org.